I found him on my back porch on the coldest night of the year, a small bundle of matted fur barely moving against the frozen deck. My name is Margaret. I'm 48 years old, and I've lived alone in this house in the Colorado mountains for the past 15 years. I wasn't expecting to find anything that night, except maybe a raccoon rummaging through my trash. But what I found was a bobcat cub, no more than a few weeks old, trembling violently in the sub-zero temperatures. My first instinct was to call wildlife control. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what every rational person would do. But as I stood there in my doorway, watching this tiny creature struggle to breathe, something shifted inside me. The cub's eyes were barely open, its body convulsing with cold, its small mouth open as if trying to cry out, but too weak to produce sound. I knew the statistics. Bobcats are wild animals. They're predators. They can be dangerous. But looking at this cub, I didn't see danger. I saw vulnerability. I saw a creature that was moments away from death, and I was the only one who could help. The decision I made in that moment would change everything. I brought the cub inside. I wrapped him in blankets and placed him near the fireplace, my hands shaking as I worked. His body was ice cold, his breathing shallow and irregular. I called the local wildlife rehabilitation center, but they were closed for the night. The message on their voicemail said to call back in the morning for emergencies. This was an emergency. I spent that first night monitoring the cub's breathing, adding blankets, and whispering encouragement to a creature that couldn't possibly understand my words. But somehow, as the night progressed and the warmth began to return to his small body, I felt something shift between us. It was as if he understood that I was trying to save his life. By morning, he was still alive, and I knew that I couldn't let him go. The first few days were a blur of research and desperation. I called every wildlife center within 100 miles, but they all said the same thing. Bobcat cubs need their mothers, and without proper rehabilitation facilities, the cub's chances of survival were minimal. Some suggested I euthanize him to prevent suffering. I refused. Instead, I became obsessed with learning everything I could about bobcat care. I watched videos online, read articles, consulted with veterinarians who were sympathetic to my situation, even if they couldn't officially help. I learned about proper nutrition, temperature control, and the critical importance of human contact during these early weeks. The cub, I started calling him Shadow because of his dark markings, began to respond to my care. His breathing stabilized, his eyes opened more fully, revealing a striking amber color that seemed almost intelligent. He started to eat the formula I carefully prepared, lapping it from a small dish with surprising vigor, but it was more than physical recovery. Shadow began to recognize me. When I entered the room, his ears would perk up. When I sat near him, he would move closer, seeking warmth and comfort. I found myself talking to him constantly, narrating my day, explaining what I was doing, treating him like a companion rather than a wild animal I was temporarily housing. My friends thought I was crazy. My sister called me irresponsible, but I couldn't explain to them what I was experiencing. The profound sense of purpose that came from caring for this creature, the way his small purrs seemed to resonate with something deep inside me. Shadow grew stronger each day. His coat became shinier. His movements became more coordinated. He started to play, pouncing on toys I'd created from old socks and string. He would wrestle with my hands, his tiny claws sharp, but his intentions playful rather than aggressive. I knew I was becoming attached. I knew this was dangerous, but I couldn't stop myself from falling in love with this wild creature that had come into my life. By the third week, Shadow had become an integral part of my daily life. I would wake up to find him curled against my pillow, his small body warm and trusting. I would spend hours watching him play, documenting his growth, marveling at the way his personality was developing. He was curious about everything. He would investigate every corner of my house, his tail twitching with excitement as he discovered new spaces. He learned to use the litter box I'd set up for him. He understood the difference between playtime and rest time. He even seemed to understand when I was sad or stressed, approaching me with unusual gentleness during those moments. But it was more than just behavior. Shadow seemed to have emotions, real, complex emotions. When I left the house, he would cry at the door. When I returned, he would greet me with enthusiastic chirps and head bumps. When I was upset, he would sit beside me, his small body pressed against mine, as if offering comfort. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about wild animals. Shadow wasn't wild in the way I'd imagined. He was intelligent, affectionate, and capable of forming genuine bonds. He was, in many ways, more emotionally sophisticated than many humans I knew. The problem was that I knew this couldn't last forever. Shadow was growing. His wild instincts were beginning to emerge. He would stalk my feet when I walked, his hunting drive becoming more pronounced. He would hiss and swat at things that triggered his predatory responses. He was becoming what he was meant to be, a wild predator. But I wasn't ready to let him go. I told myself I would keep him until he was old enough to survive on his own. I told myself I would eventually release him into the wild. I told myself this was temporary, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I had fallen in love with this creature, and the thought of losing him was becoming unbearable. The crisis came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was working from home, Shadow sleeping peacefully on the couch beside me, when I noticed something wrong. His breathing had changed. It was shallow and labored, like it had been that first night when I found him on my porch. I rushed him to the veterinary clinic, my heart pounding with terror. The vet examined him carefully, running tests, asking questions about his diet and care. The diagnosis was devastating. Shadow had developed a respiratory infection, likely from the stress of his early trauma and the challenges of living in a human environment. He needs antibiotics, the vet said, and specialized care. But I have to be honest with you, bobcats are wild animals. They're not meant to live in homes. The stress of captivity, even well-intentioned captivity, can compromise their immune systems. I felt like I was being blamed for Shadow's illness, as if my love for him had somehow caused this. I spent that night in a state of panic, administering medication, monitoring his breathing, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. By morning, Shadow was worse. His fever had spiked. His breathing was more labored. I called the vet again, and this time they suggested something I couldn't bear to hear. Euthanasia might be the most humane option. I refused. I couldn't lose him, not after everything we'd been through together. I made a decision that would either save his life or destroy it. I called the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center again, this time not asking for advice but demanding help. I explained Shadow's situation, my care of him, his condition. I told them that I would do whatever it took to save his life. The director, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, agreed to see us. She warned me that Shadow might not survive, that the infection was serious, that his chances were slim. But she also offered something I desperately needed: hope. Dr. Chen's facility was unlike anything I'd expected. It was a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center hidden in the mountains, filled with enclosures designed to mimic natural habitats while providing medical care. She had a team of specialists who worked with injured and orphaned wildlife, and she took one look at Shadow and understood immediately what I'd been trying to do. "You saved his life," she said simply. "If you hadn't found him that night, he would have died. You gave him a chance." She didn't judge me for keeping him. Instead, she explained that what I'd done, providing warmth, nutrition, and emotional support during his critical early weeks, was exactly what Shadow needed to survive. She also explained that my attachment to him, while understandable, was now the biggest obstacle to his recovery. "He needs to learn to be a bobcat," she said gently, "and he can't do that while bonded to a human. It will confuse his instincts, compromise his ability to survive in the wild." The words felt like a knife to my heart. I understood what she was saying, but accepting it was another matter entirely. Shadow spent 3 weeks at the rehabilitation center, receiving intensive treatment for his respiratory infection. I visited every day, watching as Dr. Chen and her team worked to transition him from a human-dependent cub to a wild animal. They gradually reduced human contact, introduced him to other bobcats, and began teaching him hunting skills through specialized training. It was torture watching this happen. I could see Shadow's confusion when I visited. He would approach me with the same affection he'd always shown, but the staff would gently discourage the interaction. They were teaching him that humans were not his family, that his future lay in the wild, not in my home. But I also saw something else. I saw Shadow becoming stronger. I saw his wild instincts awakening. I saw him playing with other young bobcats, learning social behaviors that he would need to survive. I saw him transforming from a dependent cub into a capable young predator. And I realized that Dr. Chen was right. This was what was best for him, even though it broke my heart. The day came when Dr. Chen told me that Shadow was ready for release. He was healthy, strong, and had developed the skills necessary to survive in the wild. She explained that keeping him any longer would only harm him, that his future depended on his ability to be independent. I knew she was right. I had always known this day would come. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two very different things. I spent my last day with Shadow at the rehabilitation center. Dr. Chen allowed me to sit with him in his enclosure, to say goodbye in my own way. Shadow was different now. He was still recognizable as the cub I'd saved, but he was also wild in a way he hadn't been before. His movements were more confident. His eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there when he lived in my home. He approached me cautiously, and I could see the conflict in his behavior. Part of him remembered me, remembered the warmth and safety of my home. But another part of him, the wild part, was wary, uncertain about this human who had once been his entire world. I held him for the last time, feeling his small body against mine, memorizing the weight of him, the texture of his fur, the sound of his purr. I whispered things to him that I knew he couldn't understand, but that I needed to say anyway. "You're going to be okay," I told him. "You're strong, and smart, and beautiful. You're going to have an amazing life out there. And even though I won't be part of it, I'll always be proud of you. I'll always love you." Shadow made a small chirping sound, and I chose to believe it was his way of saying goodbye. The next morning, I drove to the release site with Dr. Chen and her team. Shadow was in a carrier, calm and quiet. When we opened the carrier in a remote area of the forest, he stepped out slowly, his nose twitching as he took in the scents of the wild. For a moment, he looked back at me. Our eyes met, and I saw something in his gaze that I'll never forget. It wasn't sadness or confusion. It was recognition. It was gratitude. It was goodbye. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest, and I knew I would never see him again. The weeks following Shadow's release were the hardest of my life. My house felt empty in a way I couldn't have anticipated. I would find myself listening for his chirps, expecting to see him on the couch, reaching down to pet him out of habit. I fell into a depression that surprised me with its intensity. I had lost pets before, but this was different. Shadow hadn't just been a pet. He had been a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning, a connection to something wild and beautiful and real. My friends tried to help, but they didn't understand. How could I explain to them that I was grieving the loss of a wild animal I'd known for only a few weeks? How could I make them understand that the bond I'd formed with Shadow was as real and meaningful as any human relationship? I threw myself into research, reading everything I could find about bobcat behavior, habitat, and survival rates. I learned that young bobcats released from rehabilitation centers had a survival rate of about 60%. That meant there was a 40% chance that Shadow hadn't made it, that he was dead somewhere in the forest, unable to adapt to the wild despite all the training and preparation. The thought was unbearable. I contacted Dr. Chen, asking if there was any way to track Shadow, to know if he was alive. She explained that once released, the bobcats were monitored from a distance, but that direct contact would compromise their ability to survive. She promised to let me know if she heard anything about Shadow's fate, but she warned me that most released animals were never seen again. "That's a good thing," she said gently. "It means they've successfully integrated into the wild. It means they're living the lives they were meant to live." I understood the logic, but it didn't ease the pain. I started volunteering at the rehabilitation center, helping with other animals, trying to find meaning in the loss. I worked with injured deer, orphaned foxes, and other bobcats. Each animal I helped reminded me of Shadow, and each one I had to release felt like losing him all over again. But slowly, something shifted. I began to understand that what I'd done for Shadow, and what I was now doing for other animals, mattered. I had given Shadow a chance at life. I had loved him when he was most vulnerable, and I had let him go so he could become what he was meant to be. 6 months after Shadow's release, something extraordinary happened. Dr. Chen called me with news that made my heart stop. "We've been tracking a young male bobcat in the area where we released Shadow," she said. "Based on his markings and size, we believe it's him. He's thriving, Margaret. He's established a territory, he's hunting successfully, and he's showing all the signs of a healthy wild bobcat." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was cry. Tears of relief, joy, and a grief that was somehow transformed into something more bearable. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "He's been spotted near your property. Not close enough to be a threat, but in the general area. It's as if he remembers where he came from." I didn't know if that was scientifically possible, but I chose to believe it. I chose to believe that Shadow remembered me, that he knew I was the one who had saved him, that some part of him was grateful. After that conversation, I started spending time on my back porch, the same place where I'd found Shadow that cold night. I never saw him, but I felt his presence. I would find tracks in the snow, evidence that he had been nearby. I would hear bobcat calls in the distance and wonder if one of them was him. I started leaving food out, not to lure him in, but as a small gesture of connection. Dr. Chen warned me against it, explaining that it could compromise his wild instincts. But I did it anyway, telling myself it was just a way of saying thank you, a way of maintaining a connection that I knew was mostly in my imagination. One night, I woke to a sound I hadn't heard since Shadow left my home. It was a bobcat's chirp, distinctive and unmistakable, coming from just outside my window. I rushed to the glass and saw a young bobcat in the moonlight, larger and more muscular than Shadow had been, but with the same distinctive markings. I knew it was him. I knew it with absolute certainty. He looked at my house for a long moment, and then he turned and disappeared into the darkness. But in that moment, I felt a sense of completion. Shadow was alive. He was thriving, and somehow he had come back to say thank you. In the months that followed, I began to understand what had happened between Shadow and me. It wasn't a simple story of a woman saving a wild animal. It was a story about connection, about the bonds that can form between species, about the transformative power of love and compassion. I had saved Shadow's life, yes, but Shadow had also saved mine. In caring for him, I had found purpose. In loving him, I had learned what it meant to put another creature's needs above my own. In letting him go, I had learned the true meaning of love, that sometimes the greatest act of love is setting someone free. I started writing about my experience with Shadow, documenting everything I'd learned about bobcat behavior, rehabilitation, and the ethics of wildlife care. My writing caught the attention of wildlife organizations, and I was invited to speak at conferences about human-animal bonds and the importance of rehabilitation centers. I also became more involved with Dr. Chen's facility, eventually becoming a board member and helping to raise funds for their work. I used my story to advocate for wildlife protection and to help other people understand that wild animals weren't just statistics or ecological data points. They were individuals with personalities, emotions, and the capacity to form meaningful connections. But the most important thing I learned was about myself. I learned that I was capable of profound love and sacrifice. I learned that I could face loss and grief and come out the other side transformed. I learned that my life had meaning, not because of what I achieved or accumulated, but because of the connections I made and the lives I touched. Shadow had taught me all of this, and even though I would never see him again, his presence remained with me every day. Years passed, and my life continued to evolve in ways I couldn't have predicted. I left my corporate job and became a full-time advocate for wildlife rehabilitation. I wrote a book about my experience with Shadow, which became a bestseller and inspired thousands of people to support wildlife conservation efforts. I received letters from people around the world who had been moved by my story. A young girl wrote to tell me that reading about Shadow had inspired her to become a wildlife biologist. A man wrote that my story had helped him process his own grief over the loss of a beloved pet. A conservation organization wrote that my advocacy had helped them secure funding for a new rehabilitation facility, but the most meaningful impact was local. The rehabilitation center where Shadow had been treated expanded significantly, thanks in part to the funding my advocacy had helped generate. They were able to help hundreds of animals that they couldn't have helped before, and I knew that Shadow's story was part of that legacy. I also discovered that I wasn't alone in my experience. I met other people who had rescued wild animals, who had formed bonds with creatures they knew they would have to release. I learned that what I had experienced with Shadow was part of a larger human experience, the capacity to love across species boundaries, to find meaning in connection, to be transformed by compassion. I never remarried, never had children, but I didn't feel like my life was incomplete. I had found my purpose in helping animals and in sharing Shadow's story. I had found meaning in the work I did at the rehabilitation center and in the connections I made with the people I met through my advocacy. And I had Shadow. Even though he was wild and free and living a life I could never be part of, he was still with me. Every time I saw a bobcat in the distance, every time I heard a bobcat's call in the night, I felt his presence. Every time I helped another animal, I was honoring the bond we had shared. 10 years after Shadow's release, something happened that I had stopped believing was possible. Dr. Chen called me with extraordinary news. "We've been tracking a female bobcat in the area," she said, "and she's given birth to 3 kittens. Based on genetic analysis and location data, we believe the father is Shadow." I couldn't process what she was telling me. Shadow had survived. Not only had he survived, but he had thrived. He had found a mate, had reproduced, had passed on his genes to the next generation. His legacy was continuing in the wild, exactly as it should. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "The mother and kittens are in the area near your property. We're monitoring them from a distance, but they seem to be doing well. Shadow's bloodline is going to continue." I spent that night on my back porch, looking out at the forest where Shadow was living his life. I thought about the journey we had taken together, from that cold night when I found him dying on my porch, to the weeks we spent bonded in my home, to the moment I had to let him go, to this moment when I learned that his legacy was continuing. I realized that everything had happened exactly as it should. Shadow had needed me to survive those critical early weeks. I had needed him to find purpose and meaning in my life, and then we had both needed to let go, so that he could become what he was meant to be. The pain of losing him had transformed into something beautiful. The grief had become gratitude. The love I had felt for him had expanded to encompass all the animals I now helped, all the people I now inspired, all the connections I now facilitated between humans and the wild world. I'm 58 years old now, and I still think about Shadow every day. I still listen for his calls in the night. I still leave food on my back porch, though I know he doesn't need it. I still feel his presence in my home, in my work, in my life. What Shadow did on my floor that first night, the way he trembled with cold, the way he looked at me with desperate hope, the way he slowly began to trust me, still haunts me. But it's not a haunting born of regret or pain. It's a haunting born of love, of connection, of the profound realization that my life was forever changed by a small wild creature who came to my door when he was dying. I've learned that the bonds we form with animals are just as real and meaningful as the bonds we form with humans. I've learned that love isn't diminished by the fact that it's temporary or that it crosses species boundaries. I've learned that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another creature is the freedom to be what it was meant to be. Shadow taught me all of this, and even though I will never see him again, even though he has no way of knowing the impact he had on my life, his presence remains with me, in every animal I help, in every person I inspire, in every moment I spend advocating for wildlife. Shadow is there. What he did on my floor that first night, the way he chose to trust me, the way he allowed me to save his life, the way he taught me about love and sacrifice and letting go, that will haunt me forever. But it's a beautiful haunting, a haunting that has transformed my life and given it meaning. And somewhere in the forest near my home, Shadow is living his life, free and wild and magnificent. And I am grateful for every moment we shared, grateful for the lessons he taught me, grateful for the love that transcended species and changed us both forever.